6:05, so we are getting started. Thank you all one more time for being here. I'm going to pass it over to the comptroller in just a moment, but in the meantime, I just wanted to run folks through some quick logistics to make sure this webinar is as accessible as possible. So first thing we're going to do is introduce our Spanish language interpreters for all of you who may need Spanish translation on this call. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Ana Paula, and I am going to be interpreting today with another person.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Asael. I'm going to be one of the Spanish interpreter. Thank you.
Perfect. So if you're someone who needs Spanish interpretation, at this point, you should see these icons on your Zoom, typically at the bottom of the screen. There's this image of a globe, and then once you press that, you should have two options for English, or I know in the image it says French, but you should have the option to select Spanish. And if you have any issues with that, please let us know in the chat, and our team can try to help troubleshoot that. Great. So another option we have is you can also use the closed caption option. The way to access that is at the bottom of your screen. You should see show captions, that CC icon, and that way you could see the text as we're speaking. It'll be a transcription of what we're saying, and it's also available in multiple languages in case that's useful for you. We're also going to be having an interactive webinar this evening, so you'll later have the chance to ask questions, give feedback. We have a lot of information we want to share with you today, but we also want to hear from you. So the way you'll be able to do that is either we prefer if you can use the Q&A function, just so we can keep all of our questions together. But if you have any issues with that, you can also use the chat. Or if you prefer to say your question out loud, you can also use the raise hand feature. Someone will call on you. And then from there, once we call on your name, you'll have a pop-up on your screen that will ask you to unmute. And then from there, you should be able to ask your question. But again, if there's any challenges with any of the accessibility or technology, please let us know in the chat. And we want to hear from as many voices as possible today. With that, again, any questions, let us know. But without further ado, I'll pass it over to the New York City Comptroller, Brad Lander.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and good evening, everyone. It really is great to see so many of you here. I think we've got now 130 people, mostly NYCHA residents and leaders from all across the city. I see already in the chat there's people from all 5 boroughs. We've got folks from Staten Island, from Stapleton. We've got folks from the Bronx and Queens, from Astoria out to Far Rockaway, from all parts of Manhattan, and all over Brooklyn. It's actually great to see so many people from my part of Brooklyn at public housing, including Red Hook and Gowanus and Wyckoff. But to all of you, thank you for being here. It means a lot. We're excited to share with you the work we've been doing to hold NYCHA accountable and elevate the voice of residents into the power of accountability. I'm New York City Controller Brad Lander, the Chief Accountability Officer for the city. And one of the jobs that the charter gives my office is to audit every single city agency at least once every 4 years. And so we do that. They're good, hard-hitting audits that the auditors in our office come up with and then go do. But we decided when I became controller to do something a bit different for NYCHA, because NYCHA is different. And I want to tell you why we therefore chose to focus on what we call resident-powered audits. And maybe it's obvious to you because you guys are powerful neighborhood leaders raising your voice and representing the 520,000 residents of New York City Housing Authority. That's more people than live in Miami or live in Atlanta. And every single one of you and all of those over 500,000 people deserve better than what NYCHA is so often able to deliver. This is the biggest public housing authority in North America, but so often it doesn't make room to listen to its residents and resident leaders. Residents can so often feel like you're shouting into the void, even when you've got a situation where the cooking gas is not on, where repairs aren't getting done, where the roof is leaking, where there's mold, all of those issues that you've been talking about for years and years. we thought what was important was not just to go in and look at them. Every controller does that, and we knew we were going to do it as well. What we wanted to do was make sure that we put the voices of NYCHA residents first and foremost, that you guys would be the ones to say, here's what I want you to look at. And we've, got limited bandwidth. We can't look at every single thing, but we wanted it to be residents who decided what the controller's office would dig in on and audit. That's the whole idea of resident-powered audit. So back in the summer of 2022, we did an online survey, and over 800 of you responded. But we knew we needed to do more than that. So we went out to 20 in-person family days across the city and community events. We hosted our own town halls so that we would be able to get hundreds more residents in every borough. All told, I think over 130 developments, about a third of all NYCHA developments, participated in one way or another. A lot of you helped make that happen. And I want to give a shout out to some other partners as well: Citizen Action, Community Voices Heard, Youth Build, Red Hook Initiative, the Red Hook Community Justice Initiative, and a lot of other organizations with ties to NYCHA residents. A big thank you to those organizations who knocked on doors, who spread the survey, who hosted events with us, and a big thank you to all of you who invited us into your development, who spoke your mind, who said, you got to listen to what we're saying here, who introduced us to your neighbors. We got so many responses, way more audits than we could possibly do in 4 years, from concerns about repairs taking too long, lack of transparency about where's the money going, concerns about corruption in bidding, the need for better language access, all those things. And audits take a while. Once you dig in, the auditors, they look at every invoice. They go in forensic detail. So in general, audits take, about a year to conduct. And so we wanted to be very thoughtful about all those suggestions you gave so we could pick which ones we would be able to move forward with. And that is why, after that process, we created, all right, I see Councilmember Shahana Hanif has joined as well. So Councilmember, great to have you here. And we have some other representatives of elected officials as well. But mostly what we have are NYCHA leaders from all across the city. Oh, and Councilmember Chris Banks's office, thank you. Okay, so to make that decision out of all that feedback we got, we created the NYCHA Resident Audit Committee. That was the first time ever that the Controller's Office had created an audit committee that wasn't just members of the Controller's Office, but instead NYCHA residents to be at the core of the process. This was about 20, we had an application process, we got applications, we reviewed them, we had a screening process, and we chose about 20 committee members to be part of the NYCHA Resident Audit Committee to look at all that feedback, all those good ideas for audits that you had given, and make the decisions. Which ones were we going to focus on? And those are the audits that you're going to hear about tonight. They come from NYCHA resident suggestions, and they were suggested, they were then prioritized by this NYCHA Resident Audit Committee. It was a great group, and several of them are on tonight, but we're lucky to have one of those committee members, Annette Tomlin, who's been a great and powerful advocate for NYCHA residents and for her community with us. Annette, we'd love if you would share a little bit of your perspective from joining the NYCHA Resident Audit Committee, and then we're going to shortly turn it over to the auditors to go through the findings on these two audits.
And again, thank you so very, very much for all your services and your input in actually creating this here forum. So again, my name is Annette Bell Tomlin, and I am a proud, longtime resident of NYCHA. I reside in Brook Ellen Houses, which is located in Brooklyn, Canarsie. And I've seen NYCHA at its best when it was the green grass, and you just had everything that you needed. And it didn't just serve as a community, but it was also like a city within a city itself. It serviced a lot of diverse families for generations, and for that, it's so unfortunate that we're at this point right now. So the slow progress or deprogress of what's happening is just sad, because when you see that you had to create this platform because of the lack of accountability, transparency, when funds were allocated, but there was no supervision, no monitoring, so this audit process that you did, and we all did as resident leaders, was just definitely necessary. It was definitely necessary. So, us as resident leaders, we had the actual opportunity to hold this accountability. And this is what it's about, holding accountability. Also, be partners with NYCHA to actually be responsible for essential roles. We all have to play a role. We all have to play a role here. So in that sense, I'm just glad that I had an opportunity to be, a part of this first selection of the group here that we have. And also, when I think about with NYCHA, when I was young, I was also a recipient of a scholarship for college to go to. So, the services that it provides, it's so many different opportunities. And this is the reason why NYCHA public housing is still worth fighting and advocating for.
Thank you so much, Annette, for that introduction and for your service on the committee. As everyone can hear, that committee played a real steering role in the process. And Sheila, I think we take your point as well that audits are nice, but the goal is accountability, and that's why we're doing this, to give you an update on what those audits say, and that we're not just leaving them as audits, but that we are continuing to do work to make the change they call for. And that's what we're going to go through this evening. The committee voted on two topics that you're going to hear about tonight. First, oversight of contractors hired for repair and maintenance work, primarily in people's apartments, and whether there is any oversight of those contractors and how we could make sure there was. So that's audit number one. And the other audit is about eviction rates in RAD Pact developments, which some of you said was critical information as you're making decisions about the future of your development. So that one is actionable for everybody who's thinking about the future of their development. So it's not only influencing NYCHA, although we have significant recommendations there as well. It's providing critical information to residents for the decision-making that you guys will be leading. So you're going to hear about those audits in just a minute from the auditors who led them. And about their recommendations as well. But I want to tell you about one more thing we did at the very start of the process, because audits take a long time, as I told you before. The two audits you'll hear about today took over a year to complete. But we knew if we were doing this process of resident, of participatory accountability, we better get moving more quickly. So at a family day I attended back in 2022, resident Unity Plaza Houses said that he didn't want to fill out the survey. He wanted to show me issues right there and then. And of course, he showed me the locks on the front door of his building's lobby that was constantly broken and made the building unsafe. So what we decided to do was a quick response field review. We took about 100 auditors off other things that they were working on, every other city agency, and we visited 262 NYCHA developments in about a week, every development, every door. And the results, you won't be surprised to learn, were alarming. About a third of front doors were open. 40% of the entrance door locks were broken. Side and rear doors also saw high rates of broken doors and locks. The prior controller had done a similar assessment, and the results we showed there were even worse. And of course, we followed up, gave all the information to NYCHA, gave all the information to residents, to you guys, to push hard to make change. And, I wish I could tell you that problem had been fixed, but I do know that many of the doors that we provided information on, at least got short-term attention. But what we're interested in is making sure there's long-term change. And you're going to see that in the two audits that we did here tonight, where we not only listened to residents and conducted these audits, but developed them in the way, as you'll see, where accountability to residents can be built in for the long term. So I want to hand it over now to the people who did that work so you can see the results of those audits. and we can talk more about steps forward to accountability. So it is now my pleasure to, I should say, so this was just a big undertaking. Our audit team, our public affairs team, our policy and organizing team, our communications team, our procurement and contracts team, all working together to make it possible for us to get this done together with you. And the person who leads our audit team and brought these first resident-powered participatory audits, stood up the first NYCHA Resident Audit Committee, is Deputy Controller for Audits, Maura Hayes-Chafe. Maura, take it away.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for turning out. It's so good to see everyone here. And I have to say, it's really been a privilege for both myself and the audit team to work with the resident committee and to roll out what is really an innovative process for auditing. So I just want to introduce a couple of folks who are here in the audience. If you wouldn't mind showing your faces, Jade Weeks is here. Jade handled, as the audit manager, the doors observations. Thank you, Jade. And we also have Colbin Netland, who is here as the audit manager, who oversaw the RAD Pact evictions audit. Colbin, can you open your camera for just a minute and say hello?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah.
Nice to see everyone.
Okay, great. And next, I'm going to hand it over to Edward Carey. Edward Carey is the Assistant Comptroller, and he oversaw the contractor audit. So over to you, Edward.
Thank you, Maura. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to present to you today. I'm going to be speaking, of course, about the contractor audit. What do we do in this audit? Well, in line with the comptroller's intention to make sure that residents are a part of the process and to make sure that we get their feedback. We surveyed residents at 44 developments throughout the city to understand their satisfaction with repairs in their apartments. We received over 1,000 responses. We also sent surveys to the TA presidents at 212 developments throughout the city and received 62 responses. And we also conducted some audit testing of small and large contract repairs. The small repairs that we looked at was of work that was primarily done in apartments, some of the larger categories including painting, tiling, general renovation. And with regard to the large contract, we looked at contracts that were done at developments throughout the city, which would include sandy restoration, general renovations, and plumbing work. Next slide, please. Our findings found that nearly half of the work really lacked evidence that the work was done satisfactorily, if at all. In a number of instances, we found no evidence to show where the work was done, let alone what was done. When we looked at the work and we estimated over the whole population of purchases, we found that as much as $36.6 million in spending may not have been supported. We also found inadequate monitoring of smaller purchases. We found that there was no mechanism in NYCHA to prevent purchases from being split to circumvent bidding thresholds. We also found that vendors were allowed to have more than one vendor ID number, which would allow them to split their purchases among under various numbers so that they could also circumvent those thresholds. While the audit did not find actual evidence of that occurring during our period that we reviewed, we cannot say that it didn't happen before and may not have been happening subsequent to that. We also found that there is no real mechanism to monitor the work or to evaluate the work of the micro and small purchase vendors. There is no formal evaluation process in place, and they do not ask residents about the work performed. We also found that there was very little third-party oversight of the work done, of the micro work done at the developments. We found that the development staff was allowed to select the vendors, oversee the vendors, and approve payments to vendors, which would really represented a significant fraud risk. And finally, we found low resident satisfaction on the small and micro purchase work. Next slide, please. As we found, most of the residents were never asked to rate their satisfaction with the work that was performed, and only 62% were even asked to certify that the work was completed. Next slide, please. As you see in this pie chart here, most of the residents either rated the work as poor or fair. Only less than a quarter of them rated the work as excellent or very good. Next slide. And the TA survey results, we found that while there was a little bit higher rate of satisfaction, 57% rated the quality of work as good or better. We found that when you looked at responsiveness to tenant concerns, only 39% rated that as good. So while it did a little better as far as the large scale work, there was still room for improvement. Next slide, please. And then we made a number of audit recommendations. First and foremost, we suggested that we recommended that NYCHA investigate and recover the funds if they could not support that this work was actually done. We asked them to improve oversight over the procurement and payment process, to have more third-party oversight of this work, not just leave it all in the hands of the development staff. We asked them to hold vendors accountable, to make sure that they're keeping adequate records of the work that's being done. And we also recommended that they implement a robust vendor evaluation system. They should evaluate the small purchase vendors, and even with the larger vendors, even though they'd had a process in place, we found many instances that the evaluations either were not done or they were just not very detailed to indicate the quality of the work that was done. Next slide, please. And with regard to resident engagement, I'm going to turn this next portion over to Nicole Christo, so she can speak on that a little bit further.
Great. Thank you so much, Edward. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole, housing organizer here at the Comptroller's office. So you all just heard some distressing results from our audit, and a big takeaway is that NYCHA is really missing out on the opportunity to get feedback from residents. That's why this next section is a proposal on how we can make NYCHA better using technology and resident engagement. So some important goals for us are deeper resident engagement in the first place, because that often leads to more resident satisfaction. If NYCHA is genuinely listening to and responding to resident feedback, the agency is more likely to improve for people's day-to-day quality of life. The second goal is promoting transparency, making sure there's accessible public data to inform which contractors are being selected, to increase accountability so that contractors know that their work is actually being watched and actually being evaluated. And finally, it's important that, like the comptroller said, instead of complaints going into the void, we foster real democratic participation where NYCHA residents have a say in the operations of their home. Just having the My NYCHA app or an annual survey is certainly not enough for that. That's why one of our major proposals is to create an easy to use, accessible, and multilingual tool similar to Yelp. And that tool would help evaluate contractors that do repair and maintenance work, which we're calling a vendor scorecard. If you've ever looked up a restaurant online, you've seen reviews from people who have been there. Companies that do repair and construction work in the private industry get public reviews. There's no reason why NYCHA residents shouldn't be able to review their contractors as well. When a contractor is selected to do work in your unit, you should be able to see all the prior reviews from other residents who have experienced work from that contractor as well. So we actually have a great team that did a mock-up of what this could look like and how it would work. So in the first image here, you see a list of contractors. This is all just a sample, but it's a list of contractors that do maintenance work at NYCHA. And say you click one of those, something like the second screen in the middle would show up that shows you how residents rated it based on things like the quality of the work, professionalism of the staff, and overall satisfaction. The third image shows a visualization of that sample rating, and the one on the right is a sample comment where you can elaborate on those ratings. So it's fairly straightforward, and here's a nice little graphic of it. You rate a contractor after the repair is done, and that gets incorporated into the contractor's scorecard. You can see it in action here, scrolling through all the different pages that I just showed on the previous slide. But something that's really obviously important is that there's a real digital divide here in New York City. Not everyone is tech savvy, not everyone has access to the technology. That's why successful implementation would require NYCHA to conduct in-person multilingual outreach, work more with community partners to knock on doors, make phone calls, send texts, send mail surveys, and also expand programs like the Big Apple Connect program to ensure NYCHA residents have access to free and reliable internet. Of course, no one should be left behind because of a lack of tech access. And finally, it's not enough to just get reviews and not do anything with them. We want all the input that goes into the app to actually lead to meaningful change. So if a contractor receives consistently poor performance evaluations, they should be placed on a vendor watch list. Vendors on that watch list would then have to identify specific steps they're going to take to address the issues that residents named. From there, NYCHA should implement a policy that then triggers additional inspections and quality assurance checks for those contractors on the watch list. And finally, the vendor scorecard needs to actually be integrated into NYCHA's operational culture. When a staff member at NYCHA is making a decision around which contractor to hire, they should take into account resident feedback through the scorecard. And NYCHA needs to be regularly looking at these ratings to make sure they're noticing the trends of contractors who are consistently doing inadequate work instead of and make sure that they're actually providing the repairs and maintenance that tenants deserve. So with that, I will turn it back to our questions moderator, Claire, to take any questions or feedback folks have.
Hello, everyone. We're now going to take 10 minutes for questions. If we don't get to your question, feel free to leave it in the Q&A section. We'll follow up with you offline. Now, if you'd like to ask a question aloud, raise your hand using that function, and you'll be invited to unmute. And please limit to one question about the audit and topics that we're currently discussing. And after a minute, we will need to mute your microphone again to allow time for responses and other questions. So please start with your question and be as succinct as possible.
And we'll have a little time at the end for broader, if you have an idea for a different audit. We want to present the 2 audits we did and get Q&A on those. So this is sort of feedback on the repair audit and the Yelp for NYCHA repairs app you just saw. If you have questions about those broader questions or other ideas, we'll take at the end after we present the eviction rates audit.
Fantastic. All right.
I see a few points in the chat. So I think yes to making sure it's simple and easy to use. Yes, as Nicole said, there's good language access and opportunities if you're not tech savvy to be able to give your feedback. The idea here is that after the repair is done and before the vendor is paid, the resident whose work the unit was done in has to get either an email, a text, or in-person outreach. And have the opportunity to give this feedback so that it'll add up to a real accountability scorecard.
All right, I'm seeing some hands raised now, so I'm going to go ahead and start inviting people to unmute. The first I'm seeing here is Melanie Ocello. I'm going to hit allow to talk now if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Good. Thank you very much, Controller Lander, for hosting this very important meeting. My first question, well, the only question that I really have is that I feel this pertains to NYCHA residents, but some of us NYCHA residents are in a silo. As soon as we're converted to RadPath, we can no longer access the NYCHA app. So we just recently completed RadPath, and we were #1, never included in any surveys. As a TA president, I've never been contacted for anything, and we would like to be, because RadPath doesn't end when the construction is over. We still have a lot of things, and I understand that you're going to investigate and recover public funds, but there are things that still need to be done, and some things that we still need to revisit. So what happens with us? I'm part of the Manhattan Bundle, and they've kind of called us the guinea pigs of Rad Pact, which is really unfair because we still have things that need to be resolved. So thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, for that question and for raising your voice. The second audit we're going to present is basically entirely about Rad Pact. So we did not neglect Rad Pact tenants in this process. You were well represented on the NYCHA Resident Audit Committee. I'm sorry you didn't, hear from us or we didn't get connected to you before, but Rad Pact tenants and leaders were very much included. And the app that's being developed here could absolutely be used by in Rad Pact developments as well. And this is one of those places where I'll just speak to the long-term work of accountability. So we did the audit, you saw the numbers, we've laid out this very simple idea. Now it's going to have to be residents and some of the groups on the line to make sure that this actually happens in the next administration. So you guys know I'm running for mayor. I'm committed that you'll have this app as part of accountability if I'm there. But it's worth asking every other candidate who's running for mayor, hey, we saw this idea in the controller's audit. We want this. Are you committed to do it? And similarly, you should ask, are you committed that that in Rad Pact developments, this would be available? The idea of this app, we found in a lot of places, including with private landlords who, provide their residents with an ability to give this kind of feedback. So this can work for NYCHA, traditional Section 9 NYCHA. It can work for the trust, and it could work for Rad Pact residents as well.
Thank you so much. Going next to a question that I'm seeing in the question and answer section. What does the comptroller plan to recommend any local legislative changes to ensure vendors are held accountable in a better way?
That is a great question because, yes, I gave you one possible vehicle for accountability, which is to use the mayor's race to demand that mayoral candidates commit to implementing the recommendations that we've laid out here, including the app, but also the other recommendations from the audit. But some of them could be done legislatively as well. Because NYCHA is an authority, it would probably have to be done at the state legislature rather than the city council. We have both council members and legislative staff on the line here. But we'll make sure to share the audit and the Yelp for NYCHA report and recommendations. We already have with some of the staff, but I'll make sure we've shared it with the relevant committee chairs in the Assembly, the Senate, and the City Council, because it may be possible to legislate that some of the recommendations in the report get put into law rather than, just being recommendations from the controller's office or things that you demand in the context of the mayor's race. So good suggestion. Thank you.
We also have a few questions here about the Yelp-like app. One question that we got is, when does the scorecard for NYCHA vendors begin and how soon can it be used?
So this was something that NYCHA and City Hall will have to put in place because they're the ones who have access to when the vendors are hired, who they are, what apartments it is in, all of your contact information. We have made this recommendation to NYCHA. Unfortunately, what they said, and so we keep a recommendations tracker that one of my staff will drop in the chat every time we do an audit. We put all the recommendations out publicly, and then we have a tracker. Unfortunately, in this case, what NYCHA did, which really frustrated me a lot, was claim that they already have a feedback app in the form of My NYCHA, which of course you guys know is not anything like what we're talking about here because it doesn't give you the ability to give feedback on the actual repair work. And we called them out for this. So what's going to be necessary is for NYCHA leadership or for the next mayor to put this app in place. Once it gets turned on, the beauty of this is that the scorecards come from you. Once it's working and people start giving feedback on the next repair, as soon as there's a body of repairs, you start to see what that adds up to as the vendor scorecard. You don't have to wait and have the bureaucracy take a year, whatever. Our audit takes a long time. The beauty of real-time resident feedback, like you have with Yelp or your Uber app or anything else, is that people's feedback becomes the accountability scorecard in real time. So once this is established and turned on, and it doesn't take a lot to create an app like this. You see, we mocked it up here. There's many different platforms for technology like this. It can go into effect right away.
Thank you so much. We are actually at 10 minutes. I know there's still a lot of hands raised people who have questions to ask. I'd like to encourage you to put those questions into the question and answer section so we can reply to you either there or follow up with you over email. Definitely very interested in hearing what you have to say. So be sure to put those in the chat, the Q&A, or send it over email so that we can move on to the next section of our presentation.
Okay, good evening again. Maura, in case you've forgotten, and I'm going to be talking about the RAD Pact eviction audit. Next slide, please. So what questions, usually when you plan an audit, in order to plan, you have to decide what you're really looking at and what you want to achieve from it. There were really two principal questions we went into the audit that we wanted to make sure we answered. And the first one was, do PACT property managers do everything NYCHA says they should do to prevent evictions, right? When NYCHA went to residents and suggested they vote for RAD Pact, it came with certain promises, so we wanted to know to what extent they were really following up with the RAD Pact partners to see whether they did what they said they should do. The second part was to look at eviction rates to see to what extent they were the same or different against regular NYCHA, right? And also how they compared to the citywide eviction rates. Next slides. Okay, so this is what we found. We found that PACT properties significantly increased eviction rates between fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 24. You can see on the slide the orange line, that is PACT. PACT eviction rates generally exceeded NYCHA's rate of evictions, which is the green line, and comes very close to the citywide eviction rate, which is the blue line. Next slide. So the other thing to keep in mind is that the eviction rates of PACT varied a lot, really dramatic differences based on the PACT property manager who was assigned. C&C Management, which manages Linden, Baychester, Murphy, and Harlem River, had the highest eviction filing rates in the PACT system. PACT property managers is another finding. PACT property managers did not report all of the eviction and pre-eviction activity to NYCHA, and NYCHA asset managers did not adequately review the reports to ensure accuracy. Next slide, please. Yeah. NYCHA issued a blanket policy to all of the PACT property managers, but they did not follow up to determine whether the PACT property managers develop standard operating procedures for each of their sites to determine how people should conduct pre-eviction outreach, what were the standards for eviction notices and filings, and other things related to eviction. We also found that the PACT properties did not always perform what NYCHA said they should do in terms of required outreach, and they did not always provide letters to tenants who were detailing, letting them know that they were entitled to free legal services. Next slide, please. Yeah, we issued a number of recommendations and, not unexpectedly, NYCHA accepted some and agreed with some and disagreed with others. They agreed to monitor the eviction data by development, right, and by PACT property manager. They agreed to improve internal processes for oversight and tracking of pre-eviction outreach, and they agreed to improve its monitoring tool. They disagreed with trend analysis of eviction rates, which is something that we wanted them to do. They also did not agree, and I think this is an interesting one, to consider PACT property manager performance before awarding new developments. That was something they had promised to do early in the process, but when it came to it in the recommendations, they would not agree to do so formally. And we also asked them to post annualized eviction rates for each PACT property manager, and they disagreed with this recommendation. Next slide. Yeah. So, just to recap, we found that the PACT eviction rates pretty much match citywide private rental housing more closely than traditional NYCHA units. And we found that NYCHA failed to ensure the standard operating procedures, leaving outreach, eviction filings, and eviction rates to vary very widely amongst PACT partners. And we think that's something that should be corrected. Next slide. Yeah. Yeah. So this is just a posting of where, Brad mentioned the recommendations tracker. This is public facing. This will show you every recommendation made, not just for NYCHA, but for all audits that were issued during Brad Lander's term, beginning in January 1, 2022. We update it regularly. And we've also provided you with links to the 3 reports that were mentioned here for repairs, the evictions, and also for doors observations.
All right, thank you so much, Maura. We will now go to the question and answer portion for the RAD PACT audit. First of all, I am seeing a hand raised from the Reverend Carmen Hernandez. So I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk and ask to unmute now. Just another reminder, 1 minute for speaking, keep it topical to the audit, and looking forward to hearing what you have to ask.
Yes, hi, good evening, everyone. I'll make it very quick. Brad, we met a couple of times. Reverend Carmen Hernandez, also the president of the New York City LGBTQS Chamber of Commerce. And we spoke in person, which I want to give you a tour to our development. NYCHA has been bullying and TA president and his tenants to turn into RAD. We did a voting in paper that we do not want RAD. We want Section 9. They have abandoned our development with no fundings. And now they came up with that we're going to get FEMA. So we hopefully that will go through. But I would love to give you a tour. If we could schedule a date and time, I really, truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here, Reverend. Nina Saxon is going to put her information in the chat. And she, as many of you know, because you've known Nina a long time, is our NYCHA resident liaison. We will do our best. There's, to get to as, I've been proud to get to as many of your developments as I can so far. I'd love to keep coming to more to present this information. We can bring out the detail from the audit. So thank you. Reach out to Nina and we'll follow up with you.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate it.
We also have a question about the audit in the chat here. Where percentage of PACT evictions were based on rent arrears, what were other reasons for PACT evictions?
Maura, you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. And Colvin, feel free to chime in. If you look at the audit report, you'll see that we looked at 2 different kinds of evictions. One had to do with rental arrears. The other has to do with what lawyers broadly call holdovers, which is a whole range of other kinds of things that could lead to eviction. And you will see in the audit that there are figures for both.
Yeah, and we could get back to the final numbers for the difference, but I believe it was somewhere around 8% for non-payment and 20% for holdover cases.
Thank you, Colvin.
Another question we're seeing here about the audit, is there a list of RAD PACT managements that are in violation of not following the rules as far as evictions?
Did we disclose the actual by each partner name? Did we, Colvin?
I mean, part of the audit, we had, all of the PACT property managers to some extent didn't perform all the outreach that was required of them. and that's in one of the sections of the report. But that's just as far as pre-eviction outreach goes. There's a whole separate side of it through the court system that we didn't look at. We had looked at primarily kind of the pre-eviction outreach and the outreach and eviction filing side of it.
I'm noticing some hands raised as well, so I'm going to invite Karen Blondell to come off mute.
Hi, Karen.
Hello. Thank you for this audit. And good evening, Controller Lander and everyone else who worked so hard. My question is around that eviction rate. Just to play devil's advocate for a moment, I know we were in a moratorium from eviction from 2020 to about 2023. So in my mind, it may have been a spike right in that particular time for both NYCHA citywide and for RADPAC. But I'd like to know, can you actually give us the number of evictions that were normal for public housing in an annual year, and then what that new number was for both RADPAC and public housing, Section 9?
Colvin, do you have the numbers handy? If not, we can share after.
Yeah, so the question would be related to like pre-COVID related eviction numbers and then COVID and then after COVID. So the report only focuses on the after period, but I think NYCHA publicly published the pre-COVID numbers so we could follow up and offer that comparison.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. I'm now going to unmute Linda Harrison if you'd like to speak.
Hi, yes, thank you. Good evening. In respect to the evictions, you talked about the holdovers. You said 80% were for arrears. The holdovers, does that include people who are not on the lease versus those who are leaseholders? How does that work?
Yes.
Because we know there are lots of people who were, occupying space that shouldn't be there. And also squatters, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, in the RADPAC, Colvin, actually, I'm going to punt this to you, but that would definitely be part of a holdover proceeding. And this is one of the areas where there's a distinction in the process. Colvin, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the two different types of cases would be the non-payment, like you mentioned, and the holdover. And the holdover would essentially be anything other than a non-payment case. Some of those cases that we did look at as part of the holdover cases were, like you said, things like squatters or things that were unauthorized tenants. We had included those in the count as far as the eviction rate goes. NYCHA also does have what they call a pilot program, where NYCHA or PAC profit managers are supposed to work with tenants who are not necessarily on the lease, but may have a familial relationship and can be added to the PAC lease as part of that conversion process. So we have incorporated kind of looking at all the evictions across all the PAC projects to get our rates. Does that answer it?
Thank you, Colvin. I think we probably have time for one more question. So Sheila Smalls, I see your hand has been up. I'm going to allow you to talk now.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks for being
Okay,
here.
and thank you for all the hard work, Mr. Lander, that you all put into this audit. The audits are nice. However, this perpetuation of mismanagement of funding has been going on for decades and decades. I live in O'Dwyer Gardens, out in Coney Island, Brooklyn, and they did the Sandy renovation. And we had over maybe about, we had millions and millions of dollars. I don't have the amount in front of me. However, I asked for a quarterly report of how they were spending and never received, I only received one in the 3 years that they've been doing the work. They're still doing the work. And my question to you is this: they took off steel fences from around my premises off the property. I saw them take them with bulldozers off the property. They were supposed to return them. They never did. So when I questioned the contractors and NYCHA to bring it back, NYCHA told me to go to my elected officials and ask them for $2.5 million to replace something that they took off our property, something that we already owned. Who can be held accountable for that? And I mean, when I'm talking accountability, are you talking about getting funding back, things that have been taken away from us?
Thank you for that great question. And in some ways, it's a good, transition to kind of looking toward the future. And look, I should have started at the top by just acknowledging, what the charter gives the controller the power to get the information to conduct the audits. We unfortunately don't have the power to compel action. Believe me, I wish we did, even for recovering where we believe that there was money paid that shouldn't have been paid. In a lot of these cases, as you saw, for about half of the repairs, there wasn't sufficient documentation on the invoices. And so we can point that out. We've called on NYCHA to recoup those monies so that they could be then spent back in the developments. But it's a fair point. We don't have the power as controller under the audit to make them do that. And, that's why doing these resident powered audits is both risky and important. Risky because you guys are here saying, okay, fine, you did the audits, what's going to change? But important because the idea was, if we're going to get change, it's got to be because the audits come from this felt need and we find some way to build in that change. So, that's why, the idea of that app, we can't make them do it, and we can't just do it ourselves because they're the ones with the vendor information in real time. But what we hope here is that if this becomes what NYCHA resident leaders demand of people in the mayor's race, and as there's a transition, that it'll become something that the next mayor agrees to do, that NYCHA leadership agree to do, and that NYCHA implements those recommendations. On the RAD Pact audit, the idea there was to put the information in your hands so that as you are making decisions about what to support and not support, and I hear you that if it's an opportunity to go to the trust, there's a vote required by state law, but for RAD Pact, a vote is not required by state law. So that's something to talk to state legislators about making change on. But just having this information obviously is an organizing tool for you to use in your development. So what I want to also offer is, from our end, we'll stick with, following up on the follow-up of these two audits, keep working with you. And we're also, going to start taking suggestions for new audits. There's only one more year left in my term as controller, but we can still, start, hopefully at least one new NYCHA audit and be gathering ideas for the next term and working. So one thing I want to ask, and you can't click on the link in the presentation, but we'll drop it in the chat as well. And in the chat, you'll be able to suggest a new audit. And we will keep following up. In addition, if you want to talk to us about issues in your own particular development, we can reach out and work with your elected officials and try to help you make change. A lot of you have those relationships, but we would be glad to get involved. Now, we don't have a giant resident services team in our office, but we do have Nina Saxon, who works her hardest to provide all of the liaison and feedback work we can. So we're going to put Nina's information in the chat, and you can reach out to her on, it's right here, as you see, nsaxon@comptroller.nyc.gov. We'll put it in the chat as well. And we'll stick together. You can follow the audit recommendations in our audit recommendations tracker. You'll get the slides from this presentation, and you can follow up and get the recording if you would like as well. The audits themselves have a lot more information than our auditors were able to present tonight. So you can look, for example, at the eviction rates and the number of evictions by every individual RAD Pact development. So I know there was a question, how do we get that information for our specific development? And if you have trouble finding that online, reach out to Nina and she can show you where that information is. I really appreciate that everybody came. I really appreciate that the members of the Resident Audit Committee stuck with this. Look, I've heard so many times the frustrations of we keep coming, we keep turning out, but things don't get better. And I appreciate the faith you are showing by continuing to show up, by continuing to organize and lead your neighbors, by continuing to demand the accountability that every one of you deserve. That is a critical part of the fight for housing justice. Cynthia Tibbs, I see your suggestion for auditing resident engagement on TPA funds. We will capture that from the chat and put it in the set of things that we're considering for the future, but you can also do that yourself at that link to suggest an audit for the future. Thank you everyone for coming out. We had nearly 200 people here from, I think, about 50 developments across the city. Obviously, winning more accountability is a long-term organizing process, but I hope you see that we are working hard to use the tools of this office to make sure that you have a better run NYCHA, that new tools are put in place to hold NYCHA accountable to you. And that's something that I commit to doing in this office or whatever office I hold, both as hardworking with my team and as long as I possibly can. Thank you all very much for what you do to fight for housing justice for yourself and your neighbors, for every NYCHA resident, and for the city of New York. I hope you have a great night.